Alright guys, welcome back to our third video and our fourth unit on imperialism. This time we're going to focus on India and see what's going on in terms of imperialism in the subcontinent. So, this is part of our sort of mini-series within the unit of imperialism on Asia. So we're going to focus on India now, then we're going to later look at China and Southeast Asia, and eventually also talk about Japan. All right, now let's get into European imperialism on India and look at the impact of that. Here we go. So our story is going to begin in the mid-1800s with a private company called the British East India Company. It was a trading company, and they had outposts all across Asia, and they're making money selling European goods to Asia and bringing back raw materials to Europe. And this is not just a private company. I mean, they had their own armed forces and diplomats, and by the mid-1800s, they had basically come to control over half of India. Again, this East India Company is doing this. And you can see here the impact of the British East India Company. Everything in blue here, basically controlled by the company, and these areas over here in red, they call dependent Indian states. In other words, they're kind of like puppets, if you will, of the British. So the British have cut a huge swath of territory across India. And India, guys, is a big place. In fact, here is a modern-day map of India with Britain superimposed on it. So this country here ruling basically all of this. That's extraordinary. There's another view of India, this one superimposed on our country. Again, a very big place, India, but in terms of population, even bigger. There are over 1 billion people living in India, so over almost 4 times the population of the United States living in a country that's, about half the size. All right, now let's get back to 1850s and talk about a turning point in Indian history and British control. It's called the Sepoy Rebellion. So let's try to figure out what sepoys are in the first place. And to kind of spoil it for you guys, what a sepoy is a soldier, an Indian soldier in the service of the British. And you might think to yourself, well, why would the British enlist Indian soldiers? Don't they have soldiers of their own in Britain? And of course they do, but it turns out it's a lot better, a lot cheaper in the long run to enlist British soldiers in India than to ship British people over to India, which is literally the other side of the globe from Britain. So it's better to make use of the native people and give them training and weapons and so forth. And so, as we just said, these are soldiers who are fighting for the British East India Company, but again, they are Indian, not British, but they're led by British officers. Now, you're probably thinking in your mind, well, gee, wait a minute, you're hiring and training Indians to use European weapons and you're not expecting them to turn on the Europeans? Well, they weren't, I guess. But that is the great danger, and that danger is going to come home to roost in 1857. What's going to happen is in 1857, the British are going to introduce a new type of rifle, the Enfield rifle. And it turns out the way these rifles were loaded was very offensive to the sepoys, and we're going to talk about why it's offensive here in a second. And this is kind of like the last straw. I mean, there have been other instances in the past where the sepoys didn't feel like they were being treated as equals, or even with any respect at all by the British. So there's a lot of resentment already, and this is just the straw that breaks the camel's back. So why are these rifles so offensive? Here we go. There's an Enfield rifle, and this is a muzzle-loading musket, and so this is the cartridge. So as a soldier here, you would have like a cartridge box on your hip. You would have these in there, and you'd pull one of these things out, and you would rip it open with your teeth, okay? And you'd pour the powder down the barrel, and there's the actual bullet itself, and you use the ramrod to ram it home. Well, what's the problem, you're thinking? Who cares, right? Well, there were all kinds of rumors going around that these paper cartridges had been greased. Grease was particularly on the paper here to make it easier to kind of push it down the barrel. And the theory was, the rumor was, this was a combination of pork or beef fat that was being used. Well, Indians are overwhelmingly Hindu, and many Hindus are vegetarian. They believe in reincarnation. They don't like the idea of eating animals. And then, of course, you also have a huge number of Muslims living in India as well, and Muslims are not allowed to eat pork. And so for both groups to put this substance in your mouth is deeply offensive, and the British simply didn't seem to understand this or care. And so this is the straw that breaks the back, and the Sepoys rebel. And it's a very brutal fight, because of course the British are just incredibly outnumbered in India. They were kind of just really living on the edge here, because I guess they were being a little confident that the Indians won't turn on them, but here they have. In the end, the British are able to put down this rebellion with other reinforcements, but it really scared the British to death. Okay? And what it does is it leads to a major shift in British policies. Instead of India being ruled directly by this for-profit company, the British East India Company, instead, that company is going to transfer its control of India to the British government. So now it's going to be a government-led operation, and hopefully with more oversight from the government and less of an emphasis on a quick profit. The theory is maybe rebellions like this won't happen again. And so again, why the Sepoy Rebellion is so important is because it's going to lead to a transfer of India from the British East India Company to the British Crown itself. And you can see some of the rebels here have been executed. Famously, some of these rebels were in fact killed in a rather gruesome way. The British here attaching them to the end of a loaded cannon, and of course firing the cannon with pretty graphic results, as you can imagine. All right, so let's look now at the British. Now that the government's in charge, what it's going to change in India. And we call this period going forward from 1857 until Indian independence in 1947, so 90 years, we call this the Raj. And it refers to, again, that time period where the British ruled directly over India. Now, of course, the king or queen, whoever it happens to be at the time, of England is not going to be living in India, so he or she has a designated sort of lieutenant, and this title is a viceroy. So a British viceroy would be sent to India, and he or she would have the power, basically, or the authority, anyways, of the queen or the king, and they would handle all the kind of like running of the government. But the British know that they have to get some assistance from the local Indians. And so they came up with a system of kind of indirect ruling, where the British would have set the policy and have many of the positions at the top. But then throughout the government in India, you would also have lots and lots of Indians in positions of power. And that would, in theory, would make those Indians loyal to the British, because their job, their well-paying job and their powerful job is being backed by the British. Plus, the other theory was Indians would be, your average run-of-the-mill Indians would be more willing to accept British rule when there's a lot of Indian faces attached to it, as opposed to just British faces. All right, the Suez Canal. We learned about this in our last unit. You might remember it's the canal that connects the Mediterranean to the Red Sea and allows for much faster travel between Europe and Asia. And for the British, the Suez Canal is going to be just an absolute boom for trade, because India was already profitable, and now with the Suez Canal it becomes even more profitable. India becomes the most important piece of the European puzzle, or excuse me, the British puzzle overseas. They called it the crown jewel, of British colonies. And so after 1869, trade is going to just skyrocket between the home country and India. Now, like pretty much all colonies, India is going to play the role of provider of raw materials and buyer of finished goods. So the raw materials will be shipped from India back to Britain, and then Britain would make those things into manufactured goods and then sell them back to India. And we can see two examples of these cash crops. One on the right is, when you think of the British, you think of tea, right? Well, that's tea. Those are the tea leaves. This one on the left is probably going to be a little less familiar. Well, I hope it's a little less familiar to you anyways. These are opium poppies. And the liquid inside, the resin inside if it's processed, it turns into a narcotic, into a drug. And we're going to talk more about opium in our next section, but it turns out Britain is going to make a lot of money selling drugs, opium, around the world, particularly in China. Now, with all that emphasis on cash crop farming, things like opium and tea and so forth, not as much land dedicated to food crops. And with India's massive population, even then in the 1800s, a couple 100 million would have been living there already. This would really put a strain on the system, and so you would see some pretty horrifying famines breaking out under British rule in India, where many people would starve to death, or at least be malnourished and be sicker and have harder lives because of the shortage of food. Now, on the positive side, the British are going to bring with them their technology. They're going to build railroads and telegraph lines and telephone lines and all that stuff. They're also going to bring about some reforms, some things like legal reforms and social reforms. And many of these reforms will be, well, I shouldn't say many, but at least some of these reforms will be welcomed by the Indians. I'll give you an example of one of these social reforms. So there is a tradition, particularly in rural India, called sati. And sati is this idea that when the man dies and he's cremated, that his wife, his widow, should basically be cremated along with him. So she should willingly basically jump in the fire and be engulfed and die alongside her husband. And this is something, as you can imagine, I'm sure a lot of Indian women were not terribly thrilled about. And when the British got to India and they saw this ritual playing out, they thought it was horrific. They thought it was terrible. And they're going to put an end to the practice of sati. And it will largely die out under British rule. All right, now, of course, as British control of India gets tighter and tighter, we know what's going to be building up in the Indians, and it's going to be feelings of nationalism, right? That's our whole big unit. We just spent a unit on nationalism, and when the British show up and they treat themselves as superior to the people they're ruling over, they just see the Indians as basically as servants or customers. It's going to lead to some resentment, and there's going to be some nationalism growing among the Indian population, who don't want to be seen as just servants. They want to be seen as equals. They want to be ruled by Indians, not by the British. And so, by the late 1800s, this nationalist movement is growing, and there's this growing desire for self-rule and maybe even independence baked into it. And this idea of India being eager for independence is something we will certainly come back to later. We're going to look at it between World War I and World War II, and then we'll also look at, of course, the end result, which is Indian independence in 1947. We'll talk all about Mahatma Gandhi and talk about the path to independence. That will come later. All right, so that is pretty much it, guys, for this video. We covered what happened in India. We started with the British East India Company ruling over much of the subcontinent. We talked about the Sepoy Mutiny, where the British were able to win, and control over India was shifted from a private company to the British government. And then we looked at how the British ruled over India, bringing some positive things like technology, legal reforms, social reforms, but also, of course, creating nationalism and creating resentment of their presence in India. All right, guys, in our next video, we're going to head on over to China and see what's going on in terms of imperialism over there. And then we'll move on to Southeast Asia, and before you know it, we'll be done with Unit 4.